Tennessee State Standard US.14. This standard says you need to be able to explain the roles played by muckrakers and progressive idealists, including Robert La Follette, Lincoln Steffens, President Theodore Roosevelt, Ida Tarbell, and Upton Sinclair. So this standard really has two parts. You have progressive idealists and you have muckrakers. So first thing before we get going with progressive idealist, we have to understand what that term means. Okay, what does it mean to be an idealist? What does it mean to be progressive? Well, first thing, progressive is this reform movement in U.S. history. And really what the progressive movement was, it was a reaction to the corruption of the Gilded Age. Okay, because the Gilded Age was so corrupt, you're going to have this progressive movement that is going to try to fix problems from the Gilded Age. An idealist is someone who has very high ideas and beliefs and things that they want to change. So these progressive idealists were reformers who had these really, really lofty ideas about how they wanted to change the United States. And so these two main guys that we're going to talk about are really, really important. And they're not just idealists, meaning they only had ideas. They were actually successful. So the first one is Robert La Follette. Robert La Follette, a lot of people kind of have given him the title of the poster child of progressivism. And what that means to be the poster child of progressivism, it means you're the best example of this new idea, progressivism. So who this guy was, he was the governor in the state of Wisconsin, and he served for a long time, and he's going to do a lot of things that are considered progressive. One of the first things that he does is he fights against corruption in politics. All right, he wanted politicians to be honest people, and he's going to try to root out corruption in his state as much as he can. The next thing that he does is he fights railroad monopolies. All right, we've already talked about the Grangers and how they did this. Robert La Follette is going to do the same thing in his home state. The next thing that he does, probably the biggest thing we would label him as a progressive today, is he starts the conservation movement in his home state. And when I say conservation, I mean like environmental awareness, trying to do things to help your environment, setting aside land for national parks. These are all just kind of like really important things that are essentially progressivism. And Robert La Follette, as governor of Wisconsin, did all of these things. So like I said, he's a really, really important example of the progressive movement, okay? The next guy is by far, my favorite guy in U.S. history, Teddy Roosevelt. You can just look at him here, just a different kind of guy. And we'll get more into the details of Teddy Roosevelt at a later date. But he is a perfect example of a progressive idealist. He's actually one of your three progressive presidents. Your other two progressive presidents, you had President Taft, so William Howard Taft, and you had Woodrow Wilson were your other two. So Taft and Wilson were your other two progressive presidents. And, some of the things that Teddy Roosevelt did were insanely progressive. He's really going to try to move America forward. He was relentless in his fight against corruption, against things that he saw as not fair. And the one thing that he really preached, and this is what a lot of people remember about him today, is he preached this idea of what he nicknamed the square deal. All right, and so what the square deal was, it was basically his kind of philosophy, right? It's like what he wanted to give the American people. So he wanted a square deal. We would call it like a fair deal today. Like they want a fair deal. They want to be treated fairly. And his square deal had three parts. The first part here is consumer protection. So consumer protection, what he means there is he wants to protect the average American citizen from big companies. We're going to talk a little bit later about the meat scandal that was going on in the U.S. history at this time period. And Teddy Roosevelt is going to pass a lot of laws that protect us as consumers. In other words, make businesses have higher standards for the things that they make. All right, the second C is to control corporations. We already talked about that he used the Sherman antitrust to break up monopolies. And so if you were a bad company, he would break you up. Okay? If you weren't, he would work with you and try to help turn you into a better one. The final C is conservationism. All right, you would be tough pressed to go back and find a president who was more into conservation than Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was an avid outdoorsman, spent much of his life outdoors in the wild, at different places in the United States, and he really believed in preserving what our country has for future generations. And a lot of our national parks, you can really look back and you can trace them back to this guy right here. So the next big part of this standard, we talked about the progressive idealist. Now we're going to talk about a group called the Muckrakers. The Muckrakers are probably the most important people to the progressive movement. And we'll talk about why here in a second, why these guys, we're going to consider them so important to the progressive movement. But the first thing, you can see these two questions we got here on the left is we've got to understand, what is a muckraker? What does that mean? So what a muckraker is, okay, a muckraker, they're usually journalists, so they're writers of some type. And what they do is they find the bad in society, so find bad and write about to cause change. So they're not, really concerned with becoming famous, becoming rich. They're going to find bad things that are wrong, write about them to bring attention to them in hopes that they're going to change America for the better. So these muckrakers are going to go out throughout the United States and do this. And like I said, they're looking for anything: corruption in politics, products that aren't being made well by companies, strikes where companies aren't paying their workers very much. They're looking for everything. And so during the progressive movement, this group of muckrakers really becomes kind of the engine for progressivism. So that's the next question. Why are they so important to the progressive movement? They were pretty much the engine that drives the progressive movement. So engine that drives progressive movement. All right, and what I mean by that is these are the guys that found the things that needed to be fixed. Remember, the progressive movement was all about progress. It's all about changing America for the better. And the muckrakers were the ones that would say, look, over here, this is what needs to be changed. So that's why they're so important. And we're going to talk about 3 of them here individually about why they're so important. But before we do that, let's just look at this cartoon. This cartoon is a great example of muckrakers. So what you have here is you have President Teddy Roosevelt. All right, you can see the Capitol building back here in the background. All right, and what he's doing is he has this rake, and you can see he's holding his nose. Obviously what he's raking here smells. You can see all of these stink lines coming up from it, and it says down in here meat scandal, and we're going to talk about the meat scandal here in a second. But that's, this picture is a great example of what a muckraker is. A muck, what muck is, we would consider that like dirt or filth today. And so what Teddy Roosevelt's doing is he's going out and he's raking this dirt and he's stirring it up. So he's finding the bad, he's stirring it up, and remember, their goal is to cause change. And that's what the muckrakers are going to do. All right. So we're going to talk about a few individual muckrakers now. So our first muckraker is the one that's probably the least famous, and that's not saying he's not important. His book was really important, but just not as well known as the next 2. So Lincoln Steffens is the first one. Lincoln Steffens is going to write the book. It's called The Shame of the Cities. So remember, like we said, these muckrakers, they go out, they find bad things, write about them, and cause change. And all of their books are going to become insanely popular. All right, so The Shame of the Cities, what this book is, it is a book that details the link between big business and politics. So it's about the link between big business and politics. So what Steffens is trying to prove is he's trying to prove that there's corruption, that businessmen own politicians and are making politicians vote in certain ways. And so his book is really all kind of focused on this. Okay, he really wants to, prove to people that these big businesses are corrupt and that they're controlling the government. And the big thing about his book is after he writes it, there's actually an investigation into it. Okay, and it actually finds that the majority of what he said is true in his book. So he calls this change, right? He finds something bad, brings it to light, and it gets dealt with. And that's the whole purpose of Muckrakers. All right, the next muckraker, Ida Tarbell, is a really, really important muckraker. Okay, she's going to write the book. Her book is called History of Standard Oil. All right, and her book is about the company Standard Oil, which, if you remember Standard Oil from when we talked about a while ago, Standard Oil was the company that was owned by the robber baron John D. Rockefeller, and it was a monopoly. So what her goal is with her book is she wants to write about the monopoly and show people just why it is that this monopoly is so bad. Now, Ida Tarbell, she had a little history with Standard Oil. Her family was actually put out of business by Standard Oil. So she really had like a personal connection with this. And she was really able to, understand before even researching this book about just how corrupt and how evil Standard Oil is. And her book focuses on that. And she did all this research into the financials, into all these corrupt things that Standard Oil was doing. And now remember, just like with all of these muckrakers, the goal is to cause change. And Ida Tarbell is absolutely going to do that. Her book actually leads to the breaking up of Standard Oil. All right, so after her book is published, it becomes so popular that the government says, you know what, we got to investigate Standard Oil. If what Ida Tarbell is saying is true, we have a serious problem. And so they actually investigated, determined that what she reported was true, and they ended up breaking up Standard Oil into a bunch of small companies instead of one big, huge monopoly that could control the United States. So once again, change, right? Muckrakers, they're writing about bad things, in this instance, a monopoly like Standard Oil, and they're causing change. All right, the last muckraker is probably the most famous today, and it's really just because of how gross his book is. The guy's name is Upton Sinclair, which is a cool name to start with, but his book is called The Jungle. Now, it's not the Jungle Book as told by Disney. This is about a different type of jungle. This is a jungle business, like the wild, wild jungle of a particular business. So his book is going to deal with the meat industry. So it's really kind of like a look behind the curtain in terms of how your meat, how your beef is made, how it's slaughtered, how it's processed, what the lives are like of the people who are living and working in these factories. And what Upton Sinclair does is he actually goes undercover and he works in one of these meat processing plants for a while. And then once he is done working there, he writes this story about a made-up family. He didn't use real people's names, but in this book, he tells the true stories by using a made-up family. And it's really just kind of like what these people experienced and saw working in these meat factories. And guys, we'll look at the book more closely in class, but some of the stuff that he talks about in this book are so disturbing. I mean, it's just unreal. I'm talking about just the details into, how the animals were slaughtered, how inhumane it was, the amount of filth there was. It's really terrifying. One of the most famous stories in the book is where a guy actually falls into these boiling tubs of meat and is actually boiled to death and is put out or is actually not fished out, but his body is grinded up and goes out as beef that the company sells. And that's just to name a few of the stories. It gets way, way worse. But the big thing about his book, The Jungle, is one, it causes a public outcry. When Teddy Roosevelt, who was president at this time period, reads this book, he literally goes and throws up. He's so grossed out by what it is. And so it actually leads to 2 new laws. And these 2 new laws, we'll talk about more later, are going to fix this whole meat industry. They're going to clean it up and create rules so that these companies can no longer do these gross things that Upton Sinclair wrote about. So like I said, Upton Sinclair, the subject of his book, The Jungle, very disturbing, but I'm glad that he wrote the book so that we can have more faith in the way that our foods are produced today.